My brother called me the morning after our father's funeral to ask how much the lumberyard was worth. Not how are you holding up, not we should talk about what comes next, just how much is it worth, like Dad was already a line item on a spreadsheet. I told him I didn't know off the top of my head, which was true, and I told him we'd figure it out together, which I believed at the time. That was 18 months ago. And if I'd known what he was already planning when he made that call, if I'd known he'd been talking to a lawyer for 6 weeks before Dad even died, I would have answered that question very differently. My name is Liam Calloway. I'm 51 years old. I've run Calloway Lumber and Supply out of Bend, Oregon for the last 16 years, and before that I worked every job in the place since I was 14, pulling nails out of returned boards, stacking pallets, running the forklift before I was probably legally old enough to do it. My father built that business from a single truck and a handshake reputation. When he handed it to me, he didn't hand me something finished. He handed me something I had to keep finishing every single day. My brother is 4 years younger than me. He moved to Seattle after college, got into commercial real estate, did well for himself. We talked on holidays, texted sometimes about football. We weren't close the way we used to be as kids, but I didn't think we were anything but brothers. I thought the distance was just geography. I was wrong about that. Dad's health started going in the spring of 2022. Congestive heart failure, then a fall, then complications. He held on longer than the doctors expected. That was just who he was. But by October, we all knew it was a matter of when. I was driving down to Medford every weekend to see him. My brother came twice. I didn't hold it against him. I told myself people grieve in different ways, handle fear in different ways. People pull back sometimes when they can't face something. What I didn't know was that he wasn't pulling back. He was making phone calls. Dad passed on a Thursday in November. Peaceful, at home the way he wanted. I was there. My brother was not. He flew in for the funeral Saturday, stayed 2 nights, and flew back Sunday evening. Monday morning, my phone rang. "So I've been thinking," he said, "and I really think we need to get a professional valuation done on the business and the property." The property was 11 acres outside Bend that Dad had owned since 1987. The lumberyard sat on 6 of those acres. The other 5 were just land, timber, mostly some cleared pasture. It had been in our family for 35 years. I said sure, we could do a valuation. That seemed reasonable. I wasn't thinking about any of this in adversarial terms. I was thinking about grief and logistics. "I also think," he said, "that we should talk about a buyout." I asked him what he meant. Well, Dad didn't leave a formal operating agreement. We're 50-50 on everything. I think it makes more sense for one of us to own the business outright instead of this half-and-half situation. And honestly, Liam, I've got investors who are interested in the property. Real interest. We could probably move it for 2.8, maybe 3 million if we position it right. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the lumber yard for a long moment after he said that, looking at the sign with my family's name on it, watching a guy I'd known for 20 years load a flatbed with pressure-treated posts. "I'm not selling the property," I said. "Okay," he said. "That's what we need to talk about." That was the beginning of it. What I didn't understand yet was the timetable he'd been running. He'd retained a probate attorney in early October while Dad was still alive. He'd had preliminary conversations with 2 commercial property developers about the Bend acreage. He'd pulled the county assessor records, the business's state registration, even the deed history on the property going back to when Dad bought it. He knew exactly what we had. He'd known for weeks. And I'd been driving to Medford every weekend holding my father's hand. I don't say that to make myself into a martyr. I say it because that asymmetry of information is the whole story. He had a head start I didn't know existed, and he used it. Over the following 3 months, the pressure came in waves. First it was emails. Reasonable sounding, CC in his attorney, asking me to consider various liquidity options. Then it was a formal letter proposing a buyout figure that valued my 16 years of sweat equity at roughly what the land alone was worth, meaning the business I'd build on top of it was in his math worth almost nothing. Then it was a phone call where he told me, in a voice I'd never heard from him before, flat and careful, that he had the legal standing to force a partition sale if we couldn't reach an agreement. A partition sale. That's when co-owners of a property can't agree and a court orders the property sold and the proceeds split. It's a real legal mechanism. And he was right that he had standing to pursue it. I hung up and called my own attorney for the first time. Her name is Patricia Weiss, and she has an office on Bond Street in Bend, and she doesn't waste words. I sat across from her and told her the whole thing, and she listened without interrupting. And when I was done, she said, "How long have you been the sole operator of this business?" 16 years, I said. Does your brother have any documented role in the operations? Investments, decisions, anything on paper? No. Is there anything in your father's estate documents? The will? Any trust documents that specifies intent about the business? That was the question that mattered. Dad had a will. He'd updated it in 2019. Patricia got a copy and read it carefully, and what she found was both helpful and incomplete. He'd left everything equally to both of us. Standard. But there was a letter attached. Not legally binding in itself, but Dad had written it in his own hand, and it was dated. And it said clearly that his intent was for me to continue operating the business, and that he hoped my brother would respect that. It's not a legal document, Patricia said, but it's something. And combined with your 16-year operational history, your capital contributions, the improvements you've made, we can build a strong case that a forced sale would be inequitable. I asked her what building a case looked like. It looks like you doing some things quietly, quickly, and correctly, she said. Starting now. What came next was about 4 months of work I didn't talk about. Not to my brother, not to my employees, not to anyone outside of Patricia and my accountant, a guy named Hector who'd done my books for 12 years and who I trust completely. First, we documented everything. 16 years of capital improvements I'd personally funded. The new loading dock in 2012, the warehouse expansion in 2016, the equipment upgrades, the roof replacement on the main building. All of it ran through my personal investment, not split costs. Receipts, invoices, bank records. Hector pulled it all. The total came to just over $340,000 in documented personal capital contributions, separate from operating income. Second, Patricia helped me understand something about the business structure that my brother's attorney had apparently glossed over. The lumberyard as an operating business. The accounts, the contracts, the customer relationships, the trade name, was registered as an LLC that I was the sole member of. Dad had set it up that way when he transferred operations to me in 2007. The LLC held the business. What my brother co-owned with me was the real property. The land and the buildings. Those were held differently. That distinction mattered enormously. His partition threat applied to the real property. It did not automatically extend to the operating business, the accounts, or the existing contracts. His attorney had been conflating the two in those letters either deliberately or sloppily. Patricia wrote back a very specific, very measured letter that drew that line clearly. Third, and this was the part that hurt the most to do, I started talking to my best customers. Not to alarm them, not to recruit them against my brother. I just made sure that certain long-standing accounts, the kind built on 20-year personal relationships, had my name and my direct number listed as the primary contact, not just the company name. Nothing improper. Just making sure the relationships were documented as mine, not abstract assets floating in space. And then I waited for him to file. He filed in April. Partition action, Lane County Circuit Court. His complaint valued the combined real property at $2.95 million and requested a court-ordered sale and equal division of proceeds. I sat in Patricia's office and read the complaint, and I thought about my father's handwriting on that letter, and I thought about the sign on the building, and I thought about being 14 years old pulling nails out of boards in the Oregon cold. "Are you ready?" Patricia asked. I told her I'd been ready for 4 months. The hearing was in late June. My brother flew down from Seattle with his attorney, a sharp guy in an expensive suit who talked fast and cited case law and clearly expected this to be straightforward. Half and half the property gets sold, everyone moves on. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was what Patricia had prepared. She'd put together a binder. I know that sounds mundane, but this binder had documentation I'd been quietly assembling since January. The $340,000 in personal capital contributions, the LLC operating agreement showing sole membership, the letter in my father's handwriting, 16 years of tax returns showing me as the single responsible party for all business obligations, testimony from 3 long-term employees about operational history, a formal appraisal we'd commissioned, not of the land value, but of the going concern value of the business itself, the customer base, the contracts, the goodwill. The appraiser valued that at $890,000, and that value, Patricia argued, was inseparable from my personal operation of the property. Forcing a sale of the land would effectively destroy an asset that my brother had never contributed to building. The judge was a woman in her 60s who had clearly seen a lot of these family business disputes. She listened. She read. She asked questions that told me she understood what she was looking at. My brother's attorney argued that none of this changed the co-ownership structure of the real property. Patricia said that was true and that we weren't disputing it. What we were disputing was the remedy. A forced sale wasn't the only option available to the court. An equitable buyout, where I purchased his share of the real property at fair market value, structured over time, was a legally recognized alternative. And given the documented capital contributions, the operating history, and the clear intent in my father's letter, equity strongly favored that outcome over a sale that would terminate a functioning multi-generational business. The judge didn't rule from the bench. We waited 2 weeks. When the ruling came, it was 11 pages. I read it twice before I called Patricia. The court denied the partition sale. It ordered an equitable buyout process instead. I would purchase my brother's interest in the real property at assessed fair value, structured over 5 years with a balloon option. The ruling specifically cited my capital contributions and the going concern analysis in determining that a forced sale would create disproportionate harm to an established business enterprise in a way that did not serve equitable principles. My brother got fair value for his half of the land. He got it over time with interest. He did not get the outcome he'd spent 18 months engineering. He called me 2 days after the ruling. It was the first time we'd spoken directly since the filing. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message saying he thought we should talk, that things had gotten out of hand, that he hoped we could find a way back. I listened to that message in the parking lot of the lumberyard, same spot where I'd sat 18 months earlier, right after that first phone call the morning after the funeral. I didn't call back, not because I hate him. I don't think I hate him. I think I grieve him the way I might grieve someone who died. He's still alive. He's still my brother. But the version of him I thought I knew turned out not to exist. That takes time to make sense of. What I know is this: the business is still running. The sign still says Calloway. 3 employees who've worked here for over a decade still have jobs, still have health insurance, still come in every morning to a place that hasn't been sold out from under them. The 11 acres that my father bought in 1987 are still in my hands. I've had people ask me, customers, a couple of friends who knew what was happening, how I stayed so calm through all of it. Because I was, mostly. People kept expecting me to be angrier than I was. Here's the honest answer: I couldn't afford anger. Anger is expensive. Anger makes you do loud, reactive things that feel good for about 20 minutes and cost you for years. My father was not an angry man. He was a patient man. He solved problems by understanding them completely before he moved on them. That's what I tried to do. I'd be lying if I said there weren't nights in that 4-month stretch where I sat at the kitchen table at midnight going through documents and felt something close to despair. Not about the business. About my brother. About the call he'd made to a lawyer while our father was still breathing. About the developers he'd been talking to. About 18 months of dinners and holidays and Christmas calls where none of that showed on his face. That part still sits in me somewhere. I don't think it'll fully go away, but here's what I keep coming back to. The thing that actually steadied me during the worst of it. My father left that letter. He didn't have to. There was nothing requiring him to write down what he hoped would happen. He just did it in his handwriting on a piece of paper that sat in a folder in a file cabinet for 3 years before any of us knew it mattered. He knew something. I don't know if he knew specifically what would happen, but he knew something about what his sons were and weren't, and he did the only thing he could do, which was write it down. That letter didn't win the case for me. Patricia wins cases. Hector and his 16 years of organized records won the case. The going concern appraisal won the case. But that letter was the thing that made me believe, when things looked worst, that I was standing on solid ground. I'm telling this story because I've had guys come into the yard, customers, some of them, who've been through versions of their own versions of this. Family disputes over property, business dissolutions gone wrong, partners who turned out not to be who they seemed. And the one thing I'd want them to hear is this: documentation is not distrust. Keeping records, having a clear business structure, knowing what you own and how you own it. That's not being paranoid. That's respecting the thing you built enough to protect it. I should have had that LLC structure reviewed years earlier. I should have talked to an estate attorney with my father before he got sick, not after. I got lucky that the structure was already in place from 2007. Plenty of people aren't that lucky. If something you've built matters to you, a business, a piece of land, something your family made together, know how it's structured. Know who owns what and why. Get it on paper before you need it. Because the day you need it is never the day you'd choose. The lumberyard opens at 6:30 every weekday morning. I'm usually there by 6. There's a 23-year-old kid who started last spring who reminds me of myself at that age in ways that are a little unsettling. Asks too many questions. Wants to understand how everything works. Won't leave a problem alone until it makes sense. I've been giving him more responsibility, teaching him the things my father taught me and the things I had to learn on my own. The sign still says, Calloway. That's worth more than the number on any appraisal. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, not just the legal outcome, the whole thing. The phone call the morning after the funeral. The 18 months of quiet maneuvering. The moment in that courtroom when I understood that the person sitting across from me had been planning this while I was holding our father's hand. And here's what I keep coming back to. None of it happened by accident. Not the betrayal. And not the outcome either. My brother made choices. He chose to call a lawyer in October while Dad was still alive. He chose to research the property values and talk to developers before the body was cold. He chose to frame it as a business decision, something clean and rational, because that's easier than calling it what it was, which was taking something he didn't build, didn't maintain, didn't sacrifice for. Every choice in that direction had a cost attached to it that he didn't see coming. Because people who take rarely think about what they're actually spending. I made choices too. I chose to stay. Every weekend drive to Medford. Every year, I put back into that building instead of taking a salary I could have justified. Those were choices. And the thing about choices made over 16 years is that they leave a record. They leave receipts and tax returns and the loyalty of people who watched you show up. You can't manufacture that record after the fact. You either built it or you didn't. That's what the binder was. It wasn't a legal trick. It was 16 years of showing up. Organized into something a judge could read. I think about Hector pulling those old invoices at midnight, cross-referencing bank records from 2012. I think about Patricia reading that letter my father wrote by hand and saying, quietly, "This matters." I think about the fact that Dad wrote that letter at all, not because anyone asked him to, not because he knew it would end up in a courtroom, but because he understood something about integrity that I didn't fully understand until I needed it. He left behind what was true. That's all. And what was true turned out to be enough. The hardest part of this whole thing wasn't the legal fight. It was accepting that the version of my brother I thought I knew wasn't real. I grieved that. I still do in a quiet way. There's no ruling that fixes that part. But here's what I believe now. Standing on the other side of it, character is cumulative. Every decision you make about how to treat people, how to handle what you're entrusted with, how to behave when no one's watching, it accumulates. It becomes the foundation you stand on when things get hard. My father spent 40 years building that kind of foundation. I spent 16 years trying to add to it. When the moment came, it held. And my brother spent 18 months building something too. It just turned out to be a case he couldn't win. The sign still says, Calloway. That's not luck. That's the weight of every right choice that came before the wrong moment.